We're really glad to have everybody here this week to our Manchester SWP branch meeting. The title of this week's meeting is When Workers Fight for Their Environment. And we've got two really great speakers today. So we've got Kim, who's a member of the Socialist Workers' Party in Scarborough, and we've got Arama, who is a member of our sister organisation, Solidarity, in Australia. I'm going to go to Kim first, and then we'll go to Arama. So over to you, Kim.
I'm going to start tonight's talk by taking you away from rainy Manchester or rainy Yorkshire and back to Sydney in 1971. And this is really the middle of the development boom that created Sydney's iconic glass and concrete skyline. Developers around the city are making millions of dollars, demolishing old buildings and replacing them with office blocks and luxury flats. Here is that iconic skyline. Meanwhile, in the outer suburbs, a bunch of upper middle class women are fighting to preserve 8 acres of bushland that is known locally as Kelly's Bush. Kelly's Bush was about to be replaced by luxury flats, and these women, known as the battlers for Kelly's Bush, had written letters to all of the worthies, including the state premier, and they got absolutely nowhere. So reluctantly, I imagine, they slid down the social hierarchy and they landed here, in the lap of the New South Wales Builders Labourers Federation, led by a grassroots Communist Party trio, Jack Mundy, who you can see on the bottom left of your screen, Bob Pringle and Joe Owens. The battlers had heard Jack Mundy, the General Secretary, say that trade unionists should fight over social conditions as well as economic conditions. And so they told him, here's your chance, put your money where your mouth is. So the builders' labourers, these guys on the right at this mass meeting, agreed to boycott working on the flats just so long as there was a proper community campaign. And here is that campaign. The developer wasn't going to be put off. He threatened to use scab labour to build the flats. And so the labourers on another one of his building sites held a meeting, and they voted to send that developer a message. The message was, if one blade of grass or one tree is touched, this half-completed building will remain forever half-completed as a monument to Kelly's Bush. And the campaign was successful. There's the spoiler, a recent picture of Kelly's Bush. And you can imagine with that kind of success that the builders' labourers were inundated with requests. What became known as the Green Ban movement was born. Builders' labourers used their power to help community groups have a say in what should be built, who it should be built for, and how. The workers would put a ban on a development. Effectively, they were going on strike, and then they would physically defend that ban alongside community members against developers' thugs, against the police, and against scab labour. In Dockside Victoria Street, and this is one of my favourite pictures actually, the battle went all the way to the barricades. And if you ever wanted to know how to build barricades, well, the pictorial instructions are there on the right of the screen. It's no exaggeration, I think, to say there might have been nothing left of historic Sydney without the green bans. And by 1974, they'd saved 42 areas or buildings from destruction for profit, and they cost the developers more than $33 billion in today's money. Without the builders' labourers, there would have been no fig trees at the Sydney Opera House. And apologies if this turns out not to be the fig trees, by the way, at the Sydney Opera House, because I struggled to confirm that. Erima can tell us. So some idiot, when they were building the Sydney Opera House, actually forgot to include a plan for a car park. Working class districts like the Rocks, like Woolloomooloo, would have been bulldozed over to make way for luxury flats, for office blocks and a freeway system. Parks would have been concreted over, churches, historic theatres and pubs would have been demolished. And for that reason, for the scale of that success, the Green Ban movement echoes down the decades to us. It says workers' ability to withdraw our labour is our superpower. When we are feeling confident, we can decide that our labour should be used for social good and not for destruction and misery. And the dock workers shop steward, involved in a later Australian campaign, this one actually to end the uranium trade, put it like this. He said, uranium cannot be mined without workers. It cannot be transported without them. The mines cannot be supplied without them. That is the extent of our power. And we can use that superpower to save ourselves and to save the planet. I think for this reason, the Green Ban movement is my personal antidote to climate grief. When I can't bear to look at a collapsed glacier in India, or the latest figures on species extinction, or to learn that we've just had the joint hottest year on record despite lockdown and a contraction in economic activity, I turn to this story to remind myself there's hope. And we need that hope because if the COVID pandemic has taught us anything, it's that the boss's response to crisis is to save them and their profits, not to save us. They and their friends in government are not afraid to let us die. We've seen that in front of our eyes this last year, if it means keeping the economy open. We cannot rely on the ruling class to save us from environmental breakdown either. Clearly, we're going to have to save ourselves. But to make that happen, we've got a battle to win on our side. We've got to convince our fellow climate campaigners that organised workers are a key ally in this battle against climate change. And we have to win workers to centralising climate change as a trade union issue and ultimately taking the industrial action necessary to save our planet. Jack Mundy explained that these spheres are intimately related. He said, working class people and oppressed groups are disproportionate victims of environmental degradation. This is a quote. What is the use of higher wages alone if we have to live in cities devoid of parks, denuded of trees, in an atmosphere poisoned by pollution, vibrating with the noise of hundreds of thousands of units of private transport? And he's right. But to convince our fellow environmental campaigners that workers are a key ally in this climate fight, we've got to be able to show that workers have taken industrial action over environmental issues in the past. And I think we also have to outline the circumstances in which those struggles happened, because you can't pour from an empty jug. These circumstances are about solidarity, and the solidarity from climate campaigners can help bring about the necessary confidence. So I want to go through a few examples, really with apologies for the list-like nature of the next part of the talk. In any case, I can't conjure up another dozen green bans. That movement really was a pinnacle so far in the fight by organised workers. It was a result of a perfect storm that hasn't yet been repeated. But I can offer you other examples, and I'm hoping that more will come out of the discussion, of times when workers have taken industrial action over environmental issues, and I can predict quite confidently that they will do so again in the future. Because these struggles emerged in very different economic and political contexts with a variety of triggers, and they've been geographically dispersed across the globe. And of course, there will be many, many, many more, particularly in the global south, whose records I simply don't have access to. As I mentioned before, trade unionists were a key part of Australia's movement against uranium mining in the late 70s. And another inspirational campaign was waged by Brazilian rubber tappers, very, very different set of circumstances, as you can see here, deep in the Amazon rainforest during the military dictatorship of the 1980s. These rubber tappers were being thrown off their land to make way for cattle ranching. But Chico Mendes and the other rural trade unionists organised themselves, really against the odds, into a union, and they used direct action standoffs called empate to defend their livelihood. And here are two empate in motion. This was when they used to surround the logging camp, and usually would get solidarity actually from the people building the camp. I wish I'd got more time to go into that. Of course, they didn't win in the end. We all know that the burning of the Amazon under Bolsonaro is now at a 20-year high. But their struggle and the links they made saved millions of hectares of land in productive reserves and really helped put the fight for the forest on the international agenda. In Britain, British workers in the 1980s, early 80s were pivotal to ending nuclear dumping at sea. There was an international moratorium, an international dumping moratorium that had been signed, but the British government was determined to ignore this, until a ban in 1983 by the National Union of Seamen and other union allies on the transporting of nuclear waste actually forced the Thatcher government to go back on that decision. They've been planning on doing more dumping and not less. And thanks to industrial action in May 1976, the Barbican, for anybody who knows London, really famous Barbican Centre, that's the only large-scale development from the era that's not riddled with asbestos, thanks to these guys going out on strike. In 2009, this is starting to sort of come into our political memory, there were 2 inspirational occupations against plant closure by British workers. Both of those occupations made environmental demands. Workers at the Vistion car components plant in North London, it was only a minor part really of their struggle, but they argued that instead of closing the plant, management should use their plastics moulding skills to make things like recycling bins and wind turbine parts. But the second and bigger occupation for environmental demands was at the Vestas wind turbine factory on the Isle of Wight. Look in the top right, you can see it occupied here by about 25 workers. And this occupation became a campaign for climate jobs, really thanks to solidarity from a network of socialist trade unionists and climate campaigners supporting them. And a few more actions will bring the story up to date. Who can forget the brilliant September 2019 climate strike? That was really a step change, I think, in the climate movement, when school students made a global call for adults to strike alongside them for the first time. 7 million protesters answered that call worldwide, and the event ranks alongside the Iraq war demos as the biggest global protest ever. In Britain, as people will remember, 7 million, sorry, I wish. I think there were 200 rallies across Britain, and the TUC backed 40 minutes of workplace action. And of course, where workers were able to attend rallies, they largely did it with the reluctant permission from their bosses, like particularly at councils that had declared climate emergency. But there were a few places where militant trade unionists got their colleagues out on the street without permission, and a few of them I think are worth highlighting. Cleaners at the Department for Business were already striking in their union, the PCS, for a living wage. They marched to the demo under the banner, "A living wage on a living planet." Support workers at SOAS struck for half a day. They forced management to declare a climate emergency the night before the strike. And it was a similar story in Australia, I understand. In the first known instance of Australian workers taking industrial action to attend climate rallies or events like that, wharfies at Sydney's Port Botany, hooray for wharfies, stopped work for 4 hours under cover of action over wages and conditions. They were there with placards demanding "Stop blocking offshore wind, climate jobs now." And just as significant, I think, and we're going to hear more about this later, is the action by wharf workers when, if you remember, Sydney was surrounded in December by a ring of fire. The unions stood their workers down when air quality deteriorated. This is under the equivalent of our Health and Safety at Work Act. Management docked wages over supposedly illegal industrial action, and the unions had to fight hard and got most of them reinstated. And that would have been my final example for this talk if it weren't for the fact that we had a recent victory in the UK at the Rolls-Royce aerospace plant in Barnoldswick, Lancashire. Sorry, I'm a slide behind. This is the air quality that the wharfies were expected to work through without complaint. So the workers at Barnoldswick have been striking to prevent their plant closing and the jobs migrating offshore. Thanks to a campaign by workers, with the backing, I think importantly, of the community, instead Barnoldswick is going to become a centre of excellence, training a new generation of engineers to meet the challenges of climate change and producing parts like carbon capture parts, small module energy generation and things like that. And of course, this is in the embryonic stages, but the Unite convener at the plant summed up the victory there by saying, "Just transition is no longer just 2 words in inverted commas." I think these stories are very important in and of themselves, and I'll leave this slide up for a while. But they also show us what it takes for workers and trade unionists to feel confident enough to demand protection from dangerous working conditions that climate change brings, and to demand a just transition to a post-carbon future. We need to know how best we can counter the forces working against us, and of course there are a lot of them. The first actually is the way capitalism itself makes a commodity of nature. It rips us apart from nature, tears us from the land, and anybody fighting the oil and gas industry or fighting HS2 knows that. But it runs deeper. All of production under capitalism is a process in which workers turn raw commodities into more commodities to be sold for profit. That commoditization process makes it easier for the bosses to push the argument that you can have nature or jobs, but you can't have both. And it makes it easier for them to separate off the environmental struggle from the economic one, more than separate, actually, to pit us sometimes against each other. So you've got right-wing trade union leaders like the GMB will go along with that idea. I don't know if you saw, but they put out a disgraceful statement recently saying we should do an economic reality check before we rush for a zero carbon programme. But even progressive trade union officials have to be pushed really into taking radical positions, whether left-wing or right-wing. Trade union officials are this odd, and I have friends who are trade union officials, but they're an odd, usually extremely comfortable lair, and neither workers nor bosses, neither fish nor fowl, but there to mediate between the two. So their job isn't to challenge the status quo, it's to negotiate the terms and conditions for their members of our exploitation, while the political parties are left over there somewhere to do the politics. And although those officials have to be seen sometimes to lead strikes, the rank and file generally has to push them into leading industrial struggle, never mind political struggle. And so we've seen that with the environment and climate. The rank and file pushed the Australian Labour Party, for example, into taking a stronger anti-uranium position. UCAT in the UK, the Building Workers Union, didn't want to take a national position against asbestos, even though its members were dying of asbestos disease. So it was a militant rank and file key that pushed them, actually, they never did actually pass that motion, I don't think, but that is a key part of the jigsaw in getting that kind of action. And in every case I've talked about today, actually, we can identify trade unionists, often revolutionary socialists, arguing that environmental degradation is a social justice issue and pushing that link between economic and political issues and organising action around them. And in fact, actually, we can pick out some of those individuals, the individuals from some of these stories that I've been telling you. An Italian revolutionary called Antonio Gramsci called them the conscious leadership of the class. And I want to show you just a few, all of these revolutionary socialists of various stripes. You can see Vic Heath, the scaffolder who worked on the Barbican, who took the motion against asbestos to the UCAT conference. You can see Sandra Bloodworth, who went around Melbourne workplaces arguing that workers should get involved in the anti-uranium struggle. You can see Sandy Nicol, who led an unofficial walkout at SOAS during the climate strike. Chico Mendes, who learned his revolutionary politics from an old communist who was like hiding out in the forest. Jack Mundy, my personal hero, revolutionary socialist member of the Australian Communist Party, who democratised the union alongside his fellow officials. And I think it's worth just quickly talking a little bit about that process, because I think this organisational element is important. In the Builders Labourers Federation of New South Wales, the officials took the same wages as the rank and file. They held regular mass open meetings. They'd held huge strikes for decent pay and conditions, encouraged wildcat action, argued that their members should use their industrial strength to fight issues such as racism, sexism, and the environment, really that affected the whole class. So that New South Wales branch became a union that was actively fighting for a different future. But it's also important to note, I think, that the builders' labourers had really a fair wind in their sails. They were in a good position economically in the early 1970s, low unemployment, strong demand for their services, and that did change as the decade advanced. I've talked about union officials, and the national BLF officials had always been threatened by these kind of upstart New South Wales branch and their militancy. And finally, they were able to defeat the branch as unemployment rose and industrial confidence fell in 1974. But we have to tell ourselves as well, it's not just about the numbers. Workers, when they're facing redundancy, or rubber tappers facing addiction, don't have any, did I say addiction? I meant eviction if I did. Don't have any industrial muscle, but they can make a last-ditch effort to save their jobs. And that is more likely to be successful if they can join their industrial struggle with a campaign for wider political issues. And so, for example, there was a strong political and community campaign around Vistion in North London, around Vestas on the Isle of Wight. And the same with the recent Rolls-Royce strike, where the campaign organised this protest cavalcade with other trade unionists, bringing out hundreds of brightly decorated vehicles into the street and actually onto the motorway. And from uranium to nuclear dumping to asbestos to the climate strike, you can see a political or community campaign behind every example in the talk. I think a campaign like the school strike movement can be an inspiration in and of itself, can't it? But when climate campaigners offer solidarity to workers in struggle, they compound that influence a hundredfold. They make direct links between the two movements, of course, but they do something that is really important. They boost the climate struggle indirectly by helping increase workers' confidence. And this really is a crucial point, because workers have to transform themselves, ourselves, during their struggles so that we can transform the world. We have to throw off all of those backward ideas, for example, that pit workers against the environment. When climate campaigners offer solidarity to workers, they help make that, they heal that rift and bring the climate part of the argument, sort of part of the argument really about how we can win our dispute and how we can create a better world. So I think it's our job as socialists to get involved in the climate movement and to argue with solidarity with every group of workers in struggle, which my friends in Frack Free Scarborough who are here tonight will attest that we do that. And that includes the oil and gas workers, which is a more difficult sell sometimes. But despite working in the fossil fuel industry, actually, these people are in pole position to lead the fight for climate jobs. There's an opportunity right now to offer solidarity with British gas workers who are striking against fire and rehire. And there'll be a lot of triggers for industrial action over climate issues in the future. If COVID has taught us anything, it's that there's going to be a big battle around health and safety, more standing down from unsafe workplaces as the climate crisis bites. But there are other issues too. Governments are going to keep coming up with draconian carbon taxes. They'll let millions of jobs go during the gathering economic crisis rather than fund a climate service in a just transition. And these are all opportunities for us to link environmental degradation and social justice issues. But none of the gains we make, unfortunately, under capitalism are permanent. Individual capitalists just can't help but degrade the environment in this relentless pursuit of profit that marks the system. The destruction of wilderness, intensive farming, all of this will create more viral pandemics as well as intensifying global warming. And in those pandemics, as well as in fire and flood, it'll be working class people and the oppressed that will overwhelmingly be the ones to suffer and die. So this is my last point, really. More than ever, we need a system that produces for need, not for profit. And workers are central. I hope that I've shown you how. Socialists are central to politically and economically organising in the interests of those working class people at work and in the community. And if you're not already a member, and if what I've said rings any kind of bell at all, then, you know, please do join us. Thank you.